We're about to start. Let me tell you that the air raid alert is now on. So we had to come down to the bomb shelter. So we'll have to conduct this podcast. Yeah, sorry about that, but this is our reality.
Hello and welcome to the Frankly Speaking podcast, the show where we bring you the latest across Friends of Europe's programme activities as they link to European and world affairs. I'm your host for this one, Seán Flynn, and today, as evidenced from our intro, we're doing something a little different. Tomorrow, the 24th February 2023, will mark 1 year on since Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, in a move that has come to define the geopolitical moment. In Europe and across the world, it's impacted supply chains, kickstarted an energy crisis, caused soaring inflation, a cost of living crisis, and a huge migratory upheaval. And that's just accounting for the extra military impact. The death toll on both sides is in the hundreds of thousands, with an estimated 30,000 Ukrainian civilians dead since the beginning of the outbreak. And so, to commemorate the first anniversary of war, this podcast will focus on the stories of Ukrainians, what they've gone through, and where they're at now in their struggle with the Russian aggressor. Above all, we cannot normalise the war. We're delighted to be joined by Emine Dzapharova, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and also Friends of Europe's European Young Leader, class of 2023, Borys Tarasyuk, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Ukraine, Maryana Drach, journalist with Free Radio Europe and ex-fellow at the Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism, and Inna Shevchenko, Ukrainian author, activist, journalist at Charlie Hebdo, and leader of FEMEN International. It's our pleasure to bring you their personal reflections. So let's dive right in with our first speaker, Emine Dzapharova.
It's my pleasure.
I would like to begin with, if I may, a fundamental but I think quite an important question. This war has really been thought of in terms of air superiority, military support, and all of that. But at the end of the day, this is a war that affects people. It affects their state of mind, and it's left so many invisible scars on Ukraine's citizens and their mental health. Just before this podcast began, your assistant Ola informed us that an air raid alarm is going off at the moment of this recording, and that you're actually recording this from a bomb shelter within your offices. So I and many others would just really love to know, genuinely, how are you?
It's a wonderful question, Sean. I'm okay. I'm living my life as a human being, manifesting my dignity, even though sometimes it's quite a challenge, I would say. But as you rightly mentioned, I'm now in a bomb shelter with my colleagues, with Oля and Olena. They're next to me. And actually, there is a separate room, I would say luxury room, for the first deputy minister in our bomb shelter. This is exactly the room where I spent my first day of the war. And let me probably reflect that I had to take the leadership in the ministry 24th of February. And the first day, early in the morning, I was already in my office, and we had over 100 diplomats who came to the ministry according to the instruction, because, of course, we prepared ourselves for the war. And we had a planning meeting. It was an extraordinary planning. It took us like a couple of hours to sit and plan. The irony, actually, of the situation was that when we were planning the meeting, we understood that we are now hiding in the bomb shelter from the Russian bombs, not from the American bombs, because the basement and the bomb shelter and the building of the ministry itself, it was constructed during the Soviet period, and the bomb shelter was supposed to secure people from the NATO bombs, from the Western bombs, from the American bombs. So like when we had, after the first planning meeting, I was standing in front of my window, which is a huge window with best and perfect view to the whole city center of Kyiv. I was drinking my coffee and I saw the first missile hitting the intelligence service premises. And I was in a shock for a couple of seconds, and I screamed out to my staffers actually to go to the bomb shelter. But previously, like probably half an hour before the first missile hit the intelligence service premises, we decided to check the bomb shelter. Just, it was almost a joke. My colleague suggested that we all go and just to check the bomb shelter, and we still were in a mood of, kind of, okay, because the human being psycho was not able to grasp the very war and how it felt. So we were still having some jokes, talking about our life, about parties, and there was jokes. We will bring some sparkling, we will survive this in the bomb shelter. But when after the missile hit the intelligence service, and when we for the second time came to the bomb shelter, there was a grave silence. No one could say a word, because at that very moment we all understood that our lives would change forever. And then we spent hours here in the bomb shelter, and then there was a government meeting. I was online in the meeting, and there was a discussion about the evacuation. So the part of the government went to the western part of Ukraine, the other part stayed in Kiev. So this whole hell, I would say, started. But nevertheless, I think that my big point is different, is that even though we sometimes don't have electricity, we sometimes save the water in the bottles to flush the toilet. We don't have basic things to shower, to eat sometimes, but this what makes us a nation, because this is exactly what manifests human being strength and dignity. And I was really shocked when I was driving to a meeting, and then I spent 15 minutes in a traffic jam. And I was so happy that we had a traffic jam in Kiev. Like I hated traffic jams before, but when I understood that we have enough cars to go through traffic jam, and this means life.
I love that human aspect of it, just even being stuck in a traffic jam, and the mundanity of it can actually offer some kind of solace. Thank you for sharing this experience with us. I can only imagine the horror watching missiles crashing down alongside your morning coffee. So I want to thank you for your bravery. I also appreciated what you said about going down to the shelter to check on it with humor, telling jokes, able to laugh, but then, of course, it was replaced by the grave silence. So I wonder, is that ability to keep laughing a solace also? Is it something that you think you've taken with you over the past year, this humor, this ability to stay optimistic about the future?
Absolutely. It's crucial to survive, because otherwise there is no room for victory, and there is no room for hope. So I think that millions of my compatriots are actually, as I said, manifesting dignity by demonstrating this super will and superhuman strength in their fight when it comes to our soldiers, men and women, in our diplomatic fight when it comes to our diplomats, because otherwise, that Ukraine today, we dramatically need weapons, because without weapon, as my president says, nothing would be there. So we really have to be well equipped. We really have to be well prepared for that cynical and barbaric attacks of Russia that hit our cities and civilian dwellings, kill our people and our civilians. And then we are now experts in armament, in energy security, in nuclear security, in promotion of Ukraine. Like we do all those things that mostly other diplomats do not have as a capacity or as a skill. We really had to be very intensive in apprehending new and new skills in order our country to be much more secured. So to sum up, this war, it's a bleeding pain, but my nation and Ukrainian people are superheroes, I would say, are superhumans, because nevertheless, and despite everything, we keep on fighting, we keep on believing in our future life. Even today, we discuss reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine, and our president was very actually right in having this narrative. Okay, let us not only focus in current damage, it's huge, believe me. The damage of Ukraine and our infrastructure is huge. But nevertheless, we discuss the future. We say that there will be obviously future, because even though we have not won the war yet, but Russia has already lost it, because they discredited itself as a partner, and probably their future is not that optimistic as we hope for.
Let's turn now to Borys Tarasyuk, who is a Ukrainian politician who has twice served as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you so much, sir, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Mr. Tarasyuk, we just heard from Emine Dzapharova, who talked us through the events of the 24th February 2022, how she was woken up in the middle of the night for an extraordinary ministerial meeting. You were also there. And from that meeting, a rapid series of decisions had to be taken, which only proves how Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine upended reality. Because human nature has a way of normalizing these kind of terrifying situations, one of the things we talk about a lot at Friends of Europe is this idea that we cannot allow these acts of aggression to become the quote-unquote new normal. After all, Russia's attack on Ukraine is an attack on a European country. It's an attack on Europe. And so we can't afford to sleep through this alarm. So my question to you is, how can we not normalize this war?
Well, it is very strange phrase, normalize or not normalize the war. But let me remind you that if you look at the history of, the global history, you will find out that this history was full of wars. Last century only, we had 2 world wars, first and second. And after the Second World War, and after United Nations decided to create the future security, peace and security organization, that is the United Nations. So there were a lot of decisions made that no war anymore. Unfortunately, and nobody expected this kind of war may emerge in the 21st century. Unfortunately, it was the case, and it was unexpected for the outside world, although the intelligence of different countries were warning about this possible large-scale war. How to ensure that the war will not be a normal or normality in the global affairs. This is, of course, the objective of any peace-loving country, which Ukraine is, and this is the strive of all reasonable people in the world. Unfortunately, it happened. It happened because of the adventuristic policy of a dictatorial Russia regime. And they, in fact, breached all possible international instruments. The international and global peace and security was breached. International law, fundamentals of international law were breached. The international security system has failed. Neither from the United Nations, which, according to the statute, has to ensure international peace and stability and security. No security guarantees provided to Ukraine by United States, UK, and Russia worked. So all these security guarantees failed. And what is the recite against the war becoming a normality? From my point of view, the accountability of any aggressor, that's what we are now working over. Russia should not feel itself unpunished. Unfortunately, it was the case before this large-scale war, which is comparable only to the Second World War. Back in 2008, when Russia attacked Georgia, the reaction from the international community was inadequate. So, and this was a kind of invitation to Russia to repeat what they did in Georgia, and they dared to do this. Now this is a year since we are defending our country. We are defending not only our country, we are defending the values and principles of a democratic world, of democratic community. So, and without any exaggeration, Ukraine is defending Europe now against the evil empire, which is Russia.
Absolutely, and I take your point that normalization is a strange phrase, as war is always going on. And indeed, many of the founding principles of our multilateral organizations are based on the expectations that war will continue to exist, and it's their job to prevent them. It's refreshing to hear also what you mention about accountability as the pillar to prevent normalization. Last week, we had the Georgian ambassador on the podcast who also spoke about Russia's attack on Georgia in 2008, and indeed the inadequate response from Euro-Atlantic institutions to keep Putin accountable was itself, as you say, an invitation to Putin to launch this war. And on that point, it seems like over the past year or so, Europe and the West more generally have done their homework, and they're pressing for A, more accountability in the International Criminal Court, for instance, to try Putin for war crimes, and B, more solidarity with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. I mean, we heard about the NATO and EU candidacy status. To me, this was a huge lesson learned. But drawing on your experience of the past year or so, I would love to know, what's yours? What's your biggest lesson learned?
The biggest lesson I learned that guarantees in the contemporary world doesn't work, inasmuch as there are rogue states which have no barriers in their barbaric behavior. Another lesson is that we have to rely upon ourselves in defending our country, because, somehow we were relying on the national security guarantees provided to Ukraine back in 1994 by three nuclear powers in exchange for Ukraine to decide to get rid of its nuclear arsenal, which used to be the third largest in the world. So the guarantees, the reliance on own capabilities to defend the country, and of course, solidarity and unity of other democratic countries. So this is the safeguard against the repetition of this kind of dark times.
I was quite struck by what you said, that Ukrainians have to rely on themselves to defend their country. The resilience of Ukrainian citizens has been really clear and powerful over the past year. And certainly many Europeans feel emboldened at the sight of regular Ukrainian citizens who stand up and fight for their right to live in peace. But without weapons, without Leopard tanks, and without unity, the situation would be a lot more difficult. Now, I want to ask, what, in your opinion, will it take for Ukraine to win this war?
Again, the words and the facts I mentioned, unity, solidarity, and assistance. Well, and without mobilization of the whole Ukrainian nation, one cannot imagine, the successful result of resisting the aggressor. And of course, without the assistance with weapons from our friendly states, especially at this stage, it is difficult to imagine that Ukraine would stand. But Ukrainians indeed demonstrated, its courage and determination to defend the country. So that's what was the biggest surprise for the outside world. How it happened that Ukrainians were capable to resist the second largest army in the world. After 1 year of fighting this army, I came to a conclusion. This is the second largest army of the third world. And that proves that this army can be defeated. And there is a determination among Ukrainians that our armed forces are capable to defeat the enemy and to restore our borders around Ukraine. So this how we see the end of this war.
And this question of land reclamation, border reclamation, it's something that I would love to ask you leading into my next question. I think that we can't forget that Russia's attack on Ukraine was really an escalation of something that was already going on. In 2014, it was a horrendous escalation from the annexation of Crimea. But even before that, Russia's aggression has been a sort of an unignorable force. I mean, you mentioned Georgia in 2008. So, a return to peace is definitely one thing, but there's so many other aspects of post-war Ukraine still to be decided, possible negotiations. There's Ukraine's reconstruction, its financing. So is there room, do you think, for land reclamation in that package? And more generally, could you give us your hope for Ukraine once it's won the war?
Well, we expect that this war will be ended with the victory of Ukraine. We expect that the peace will prevail throughout Ukraine. We are expecting the accountability working. In our understanding, this is the accountability for the act of aggression by the leadership of Russia. So for this purpose, Ukraine initiated the creation of the ad hoc tribunal for the investigation of the crime of aggression, which is being considered in the international law as mother of all crimes. So it is all other crimes, war against humanity, genocide. So they are derivative from the major crime, that is the crime of aggression. All those responsible have to be accountable before the court, including the leadership of Russia, including those Russians who have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. So all those have to be brought to the court and punished. And I also foresee that very soon after our victory and peace in Ukraine, Ukraine will be inseparable part of united Western democracies. That is inseparable part of the European Union and NATO. In fact, now I hear more and more conclusions that Ukraine is de facto already NATO member. And of course, we understand that the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty cannot be a guarantee from NATO member states. So only after the war, Ukraine will be very soon member of NATO, and the European Union, we expect this year we will begin negotiations on accession to the European Union. So, and without this unprecedented, blatant, barbaric war of Russia against Ukraine, it might have been impossible to imagine that very quickly Ukraine will begin negotiations on the exception on joining the European Union and NATO. So Putin achieved contrary to what he was expecting. He was expecting to undermine NATO, to undermine unity, transatlantic unity, to undermine European Union. As a result, NATO is going to be enlarged at the expense of traditionally neutral countries like Finland and Sweden. As a result, Ukraine never was strong militarily as it is now. So this was a failure and miscalculation by Putin of his intentions.
Maryana Drach is the Radio Free Europe Ukrainian Service Director, overseeing the service's award-winning coverage of the country's 2013-14 Maidan demonstrations and developments since. Under her watch, the broadcaster has launched the impactful anti-corruption reporting project, Schemes, Corruption in Details, as well as multiple media programming efforts for the residents of Russia-annexed Crimea, Crimea Realities, and war-torn Eastern Ukraine, Donbass Realities. Ms. Drach, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I'd like to begin with, in your experience as a journalist, you've come in contact with many difficult situations. I was wondering if you were comfortable sharing these situations. What was the most difficult experience since the outbreak of war last year?
The most difficult experience was certainly the death of my close colleague. Our journalist producer Vera Hirich was killed in her Kiev apartment at the end of April, actually the day when UN Secretary General visited the Ukrainian capital. And we were in touch with Vera daily, at least twice a day since full-fledged invasion has started, because Vera led our coverage meetings and we planned topics, discussed where to dispatch correspondents. And the latest material that Vera produced was about Mariupol. She was able to find a woman, a Holocaust victim, who managed to escape from the seized Mariupol. And that woman said that it was like the blockade of Leningrad, only much worse. So basically, it was a family that survived World War II, and it was devastating for that family to witness the war. So if I'm thinking about Vera, I'm thinking about many innocent victims of this war. And overall, over 40 journalists died, both covering the war and as civilians. And to me, it is just a testimony that you cannot protect Ukrainians nowadays. Russian bombs target everybody, and there is no safe place.
I'm so sorry to hear about this, and it's never easy to come on a show and to share these experiences. So I thank you for your bravery. We just heard from our last speaker, ex-Foreign Minister Borys Tarasyuk, and his biggest lesson learned over the past year, that security guarantees are never truly guaranteed, that solidarity, Western unity, they were key to uphold democracy in Ukraine. Do you share Mr. Tarasyuk's lessons learned, or would you counter them? And maybe more generally, what were your biggest lessons learned since last year?
I think that this is not over. So I think that definitely we have to learn a lot of lessons, more than one. And one of the lessons to me is that many got Ukraine invasion prediction very, very wrong. And Josep Borrell, the European Union foreign policy chief, said that he did not believe that this is going to happen. And many believed if this would happen, that Kyiv would fall in a matter of days, many say in 3 days, and the government would fall as well, that Zelensky will be assassinated. We read in New York Times about guerrilla warfare in Ukraine. So I think that one of the lessons that we have to analyze definitely why that was wrong, and wrong on many accounts, and why this time the American and British intelligence was better than intelligence of some other countries. So I think that definitely that is one of the lessons. And another one is, I completely agree that Western solidarity is very important for Ukraine, and the witness of that solidarity was definitely a visit, surprise visit of US President Biden to Ukraine, the first visit in about 15 years. So it is important lesson that for countries at war, solidarity is extremely, extremely important. And probably another lesson is the resistance of Ukrainian people. So I think it is extremely, extremely important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the key message is that, overwhelmingly the rhetoric has been about support, about solidarity. And because of this, I think it's undeniably convincing that Ukraine will win this war. So is there for you that sense of there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and is your hope for Ukraine when this is all over?
Well, in terms of victory, I think that you would not be surprised that many Ukrainians think that already Ukraine achieved a victory if we are speaking not about territorial gains, but about moral victory and the winning spirit. And opinion polls show that around 90% of Ukrainians, or over 90, do believe that Ukraine will win this war. We know what is needed for the country to win the war, because if we would listen to Ukrainian leaders and to many Western experts, they said that Ukraine would need more Western arms, it needs modern arms. The speed of delivery is also very, very important. And it takes many components. But in terms of the hope for Ukraine, I do hope that Ukraine will stay and become a strong regional leader. And in the words of Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Gretsak, it can become the new Central European tiger. And I think that this idea can be appealing. And in terms of how Ukraine should look like, I think that definitely its membership in the European Union and NATO, this is, again, according to opinion polls, this is something that Ukrainian leaders say, and this is something which is embedded in the Ukrainian constitution. And I think it is remarkable that Ukraine has applied to the EU a few days after the full-fledged invasion. We also have, at least this is my hope, that Ukraine will stay a modern country. And I personally like initiatives in e-democracy that Ukraine launched in recent years, like app Dia. I have it on my phone, and it's really a great tool connecting government with citizens. So I do hope that Ukraine will become a leader of technological innovations in the continent, but also across the world. But in terms of future of the country, I think it is very important to speak about values, dignity. This is something which is very, very important for Ukrainian people. And of course, Ukrainians can hope that the Ukrainian model will be one of the great European models. Of course, we're talking about maybe more optimistic scenarios, because a lot of Western support will be needed to rebuild the country, and challenges are definitely immense in front of Ukraine.
Definitely. I think, you mentioned that Ukraine already has won this moral victory, and it's about values. And I think that Russia has really isolated itself and lost any sense of credibility with outside partners. So I think that you've summed it up incredibly well. Thank you again for your reflections. And I hope that you can count on Friends of Europe to also be a friend of Ukraine in the future.
Thank you a lot.
Our fourth and final guest for this episode is Inna Shevchenko, who is a Ukrainian author and activist, journalist at Charlie Hebdo, and leader at FEMEN International. Thank you so much for joining us today, Inna. It's always a pleasure. I've asked this question to our other guests also, so I'll start with this. I was hoping you could share with us your experience of the 24th of February 1 year ago.
Of course, I remember that February 24th, and of course we will never be able to forget it. It's been a year now that every day is February 24th. On that day, I was awakened at 4 a.m., which is precisely the time when Russia's invasion of Ukraine has begun. But I was awakened by beautiful sounds of my 5-month-old baby, and in a peaceful European capital, while at the very same moment, babies in Ukraine, their mothers, their families, and my own family were waking up to the horrible sounds of Russian bombs, rain falling behind their windows. And I remember while holding my child in my arms, I was watching live, observing live, learning how Kiev, Kharkiv, other Ukrainian cities, and my hometown, Kherson, were attacked, were bombed by invaders, by the aggressor who speaks the language that we understand very well. I remember that I right away checked my our family WhatsApp chat, and at 4 a.m. There was silence in the chat, but everyone was online, and I of course knew what that meant. My family at that very moment were discovering the first moments of the war that that will, that day turned for them to be a beginning of months long experience of Russian occupation. They've experienced the horrors of Russian world, and my hometown Kherson became a crime scene. Crime scene where barbarism of a kind and scale Europe haven't seen since 1944 took place, where people were killed, civilians were killed, raped, tortured, from where children were kidnapped and deported, and some of them are now being re-educated and crucified on either Russian territory or Russian-controlled territory, occupied territories of Ukraine. If that day, of course, that day changed all of us, but for me personally, if that day changed anything in my identity, I thought a lot about the feelings with which I left Ukraine in 2012. I had to flee my country from political persecutions of the regime of Viktor Yanukovych, the regime of that time, which was, of course, a puppet dictator of Vladimir Putin, and supported very strongly by Kremlin. And as an activist who have fought and campaigned against the regime of Yanukovych in Ukraine, Putin's regime in Russia, and Alexander Lukashenko's regime in Belarus, and of course have experienced a lot of violence and persecutions from those regimes. I remember when I finally had to flee Ukraine in 2012, I left my country with a very bitter feeling, and with a feeling of disappointment by the society that seemed to be apolitical and sort of passive, and the population that was giving away their destinies in the arms of, in the hands of criminals and dictators that were willing to sacrifice, people for their own interests. And of course, I left Ukraine at that time with the feeling of anger. I was very angry against my own country and against Ukrainians for their passiveness of that time, and for letting those criminals rule over their destinies and their futures. And I know that February 24th and this year, after this year, I dream, of course, very often about going back to Ukraine. And while I'm absolutely unable to speculate about the how this war will end, and what Ukraine will look like after the end of this war, because I think that the issue is too big and too serious and too grave to speculate. But when I imagine that I will come back, I will go back to Ukraine and walk the streets that no longer belong to me, where I will be just a guest, I know that when I will walk the streets of Ukraine, either victorious or beaten and crippled, I will, the feelings of anger and disappointment will have no right to exist, and I will simply feel and experience only humility in front of the nation that literally at this very moment is sacrificing itself for peaceful Europe, for the chance of Europe to still have a peaceful future. The nation that literally sacrifices itself for everything that we consider Western values. The nation that sacrifices itself for democracy. And I will feel only, in addition to humility, I will feel gratitude in front of the nation that finally, during this attack, finally became coherent, united, and truly heroic. And I will feel gratitude in front of them for probably giving a stronger chance to my daughter to never wake up from the sounds of rockets behind her window.
The justifications for this war are, and we want to keep hammering this point home, that the justifications are not normal. And the results of it, the fighting, the uncertainty, the pain, the bloodshed that are surrounding this war are unlike anything on the European continent since World War II. We've seen the Kremlin's annexation of Crimea as the invasion's starting point in 2014 and the many territorial disputes since then. So it's a question of keeping this war from becoming our new normal and from new borders from becoming the new normal. Would you agree with that?
There is still misconception and misunderstanding of the true nature of this war. It's not a territorial dispute. It is not about Donbass, and it's not about Crimea. It is really once again, for Ukrainians, it is an anti-colonial war, and neither Putin nor anyone in Kremlin, and even in Russian population, Russian civil society, nobody pretends that it's anything else. Putin justified the invasion of Ukraine by criminal historic revisionism, claiming that Ukrainians and Russians are same people bound by same language, and he then imagined himself to be Pyotr I, who waged war for Swedish territories, and he genuinely confessed that it is his destiny to bring back territories that belong to Russian Empire. So this, of course, latest Russia's attack on Ukraine, which is Putin's attack. It probably have been prepared since 2008, when Putin took West's categorical rejection of Ukrainian NATO membership as a sign of permissiveness, as a sort of a red, a green light for an attack. However, I think that the urge to launch a full-scale invasion appeared in Kremlin in 2014, when Ukrainian Maidan revolution took place, which was in its nature a pro-European, pro-EU revolution. People literally were dying for Europe in Ukraine in 2014, in Kiev, in Maidan, on Maidan, because as many know, that the regime of Yanukovych open fire on civilians, on peaceful protesters who were gathering on Maidan. So one of the important things to never forget is that Ukrainians overthrew their dictator, and they overthrew their dictator for their with their aspirations of democracy, with their aspirations for European democratic and free Ukraine. So Ukrainians literally are fighting and dying and sacrificing themselves for Europe. And as it has been said many times, there is no European nation that was dying, that where people were dying for Europe, but there is now Ukraine.
That's it for this Frankly Speaking podcast. Consider subscribing to our newsletter or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And don't forget to tune in again, this time next week.